Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive with Podcast Infinity.
I'm excited to be here.
Today we're talking about something that everyone has experienced.
Pain.
Yeah, pain relief, painkillers, all that.
Yeah, it's really interesting because the quest for the perfect painkiller, it's been going on for centuries.
Right, and as we'll see, I think there's a lot of twists and turns and surprises in this story.
Oh yeah, definitely.
So to start us off, I mean, we're going to go way, way back.
Way back.
To ancient Egypt.
Okay.
We're talking pyramids.
All right.
I imagine lots of aches and pains there.
Yeah, probably from hauling all those giant stones.
So what did they use for pain relief back then?
Well, they actually stumbled upon a natural painkiller that we still use today, believe it or not, willow bark.
Willow bark.
Yeah, they found that chewing on willow bark could actually provide some pain relief.
Oh, wow.
And we know now, of course, that willow bark contains salicylic acid, which is the precursor to aspirin.
So aspirin's origin story begins in ancient Egypt.
It does.
That's pretty cool. I never knew that.
Yeah, it's a pretty fascinating connection.
So willow bark wasn't the only thing they were using, right?
Right.
They also had opium.
Yes, opium was a big one.
And I'm kind of across cultures and across time periods.
Yes, definitely.
But it was viewed very differently then.
Oh yeah, back then it was seen as a gift, a divine gift.
Right.
It was a way to escape pain and even achieve spiritual enlightenment.
So was addiction not really a concept back then?
I think that they didn't really understand it the way we do now.
That makes sense.
So opium was used pretty widely for centuries.
And I think that is something that we'll see throughout this deep dive, is that our understanding of pain and addiction has evolved so much over time.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, so we talked about opium, but we can't talk about that without talking about morphine.
Yeah, that's right.
And morphine really came about, I think, in the 19th century.
Yeah, that's when they were able to isolate the active ingredient in opium, which is morphine.
You know, how did that change things?
Well, it was a huge breakthrough in medicine because it meant that doctors could dose morphine much more precisely.
Right.
And so they thought it was safer, for pain management.
But of course, safer in quotations.
Yeah, exactly.
Because there's always downsides.
Right.
What were some of the downsides of morphine?
Well, even though isolating morphine was this big medical advancement, it really opened the door for more widespread addiction.
Right. Because it was much more potent now.
Exactly.
I mean, and that brings us to heroin.
Ooh, yes.
This is just mind-blowing.
It really is. So in the late 1800s, heroin was actually marketed as a non-addictive wonder drug.
As a non-addictive.
Yeah, and get this, they even thought it could cure morphine addiction.
Oh my God, that's unbelievable.
Yeah, it's crazy, right?
It gets worse.
It does.
They were giving this to kids.
Yeah, it was marketed as a cough syrup for children.
Oh my gosh. I can't even imagine that today.
No, it would never happen.
It wouldn't make it past the first round of testing.
Yes.
But it really shows how much our understanding of addiction and the importance of drug testing has evolved.
Absolutely.
Okay, but I think it's important to step back for a second.
Yeah.
Before we go, too deep into all the dark sides of painkillers.
Yes, good point.
And just remember that, pain is a thing.
Pain is real.
For a reason.
It is our body's alarm system. It tells us when something's wrong, so we can protect ourselves.
Yeah, it lets us learn our limits and avoid dangerous situations.
Absolutely.
And there's that famous case of Steve Pete.
Oh yeah, Steve Pete, the man who can't feel pain.
Yeah, have you heard about him?
Oh yeah, I read about his case. It's fascinating.
It sounds like a superpower, but it's really not, is it?
Not at all. It's actually a very dangerous condition.
Right.
He has something called congenital insensitivity to pain.
Right, so he's literally incapable of feeling pain.
That's right.
Which means he could break a bone and not even know.
Exactly. Yeah, he's broken bones, suffered injuries without realizing it because he doesn't have that crucial warning system that pain provides.
So, yeah, even though pain is really unpleasant, it's actually essential for our survival.
It is.
Okay, so now I want to kind of shift gears a little bit.
Okay.
And talk about some of the, I guess the ways that different cultures have approached understanding and managing pain.
All right.
And one group that I think often gets overlooked is Islamic scholars.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
I mean, we hear about the ancient Greeks and Romans, but what about Islamic medicine?
Well, Islamic medicine was incredibly advanced for its time.
Okay.
And one figure who really stands out is Ibn Sina.
Ibn Sina?
Yeah, he was a physician and philosopher who lived in the 11th century.
Okay.
And he wrote this groundbreaking text called the Canon of Medicine.
The Canon of Medicine.
Yeah, and in it, he recognized pain as a symptom rather than a disease in itself.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, and he advocated for this comprehensive approach to pain management,
combining
drug therapies with physical therapies and even techniques to reduce sensation.
So he wasn't just saying, hey, take this and mask the pain.
No, he was trying to get to the root of the problem.
Figure out what's actually going on.
Exactly.
That's pretty revolutionary for his time.
It was.
Especially considering opium was the go-to treatment back then.
Yeah, opium was everywhere.
Okay, so now let's kind of fast forward a little bit and,
Yeah.
and circle back to aspirin.
Back to aspirin.
We know it came from willow bark,
Yeah.
but how did we get from chewing on bark to, like, the little white pills we know today?
Well, after centuries of using willow bark, scientists finally isolated the active ingredient salicylic acid in the 19th century.
Okay.
But there was a problem. It tasted terrible.
I bet.
Imagine chewing on a tree trunk.
Right. Yeah. Not very pleasant.
So luckily, a German chemist named Felix Hoffmann came up with a solution.
Okay.
He modified the salicylic acid by adding what's called an acetyl group,
Okay.
and tada, aspirin was born.
And I imagine pain relief became much more enjoyable at that point.
Oh yeah, much more palatable.
So aspirin takes off.
It does.
It's effective for pain, fever,
Yeah.
but as with so many painkillers,
Yeah.
it turns out it's not without its risks.
No, it's not.
What were some of the risks associated with aspirin?
Well, they found that taking too much aspirin could lead to gastrointestinal bleeding
Oh, wow.
and even bleeding in the brain.
That's serious.
Yeah, and in some cases, it was even linked to Ray's syndrome.
Ray's syndrome.
Yeah, it's a rare but serious condition that mostly affects children.
So even aspirin, this seemingly harmless over-the-counter pain reliever,
Right.
has a dark side.
It does, which just goes to show that, every drug, even those available without a prescription, can have both benefits and harms.
Right, it's all about that balance, isn't it?
Yeah, finding that sweet spot is the challenge.
Okay, so where do we go from here?
Well, the search for even safer and more effective painkillers continued. And that brings us to a drug that's in almost every medicine cabinet today, paracetamol,
Paracetamol.
better known as acetaminophen or Tylenol.
Paracetamol.
Yeah, it's everywhere.
I mean, that's so familiar,
It is.
but I've honestly never thought about its origins.
Well, get this, it was discovered by accident.
Really?
Yeah, a research student was actually looking for a cure for intestinal worms
Okay.
when he stumbled upon this substance called acetanilide.
Acetanilide.
Yeah, it didn't work against worms,
Okay.
but it did lower fever,
Interesting.
and that led to the development of paracetamol.
From intestinal worms to pain relief.
Yeah, what a journey.
What a journey. But wasn't there something weird about the name?
Oh yeah, there seems to have been a bit of a mix-up.
Okay.
A safer derivative of acetanilide called phenacetin
Okay.
was supposed to replace it, but somehow paracetamol ended up getting the spotlight.
So a naming mishap.
A naming mishap.
That changed the course of pain relief.
That's right.
Who knew?
It's funny how these things happen in science.
Yeah, it really is.
Unexpected discoveries.
Paracetamol, it takes the world by storm.
It does.
Safer than aspirin, especially for children.
Right.
Effective for both pain and fever. Mm-hmm. But here's the million-dollar question.
Okay.
How does it actually work?
Well, that's the mystery of paracetamol.
What do you mean?
We know it works. It's
Yeah.
effective,
Uh-huh.
but we still don't fully understand how it does what it does.
We're popping these pills and we don't know exactly what they're doing.
Pretty much.
That's kind of wild.
It is a bit wild when you think about it.
It really is.
It just shows how complex pain and pain relief really are.
Yeah.
There are some theories, of course, about how paracetamol works.
Okay.
It seems to reduce the production of certain chemicals that are involved in pain signaling,
Okay.
and it may also interfere with how those signals reach the brain.
Right.
But the specifics are still a bit of a scientific enigma.
An enigma indeed.
An enigma indeed.
Okay, well, let's take a break here. And when we come back, we're going to dive into some of the more recent history of painkillers.
All right.
We're talking opioids like OxyContin.
Okay.
And we'll talk about the challenges of balancing pain relief with the risk of addiction.
Looking forward to it.
We'll be right back.
So before the break, we were talking about paracetamol and that kind of mystery surrounding how it works.
Yeah, it's crazy to think that we still don't fully understand it.
I know, it is, right? But
Yeah.
it's still one of the most widely used pain relievers in the world.
For sure, for sure.
Okay.
But paracetamol wasn't the only painkiller making waves at the time.
No, it wasn't.
There was another one entering the scene.
Right.
One that would spark a lot of relief, but also a lot of controversy.
A lot of controversy.
And we're talking about OxyContin, right?
We are.
I remember when that drug first came out, it seemed like a miracle for people with chronic pain.
It did.
So how did OxyContin come about?
Well, in 1995, Purdue Pharma, the company behind OxyContin, they approached the FDA for approval. And they presented it as a safer, less addictive opioid.
Safer, less addictive.
That's what they claimed.
And people bought it.
They did sales just soared,
But even early on,
even early on.
some experts were voicing concerns.
Yeah, there were definitely some red flags.
What kind of red flags?
Well, some experts were worried about its potential for abuse.
Right. And then there was that whole thing with the FDA labeling.
Oh, yeah, that was a big one.
So what happened there?
Well, the FDA actually added a note to OxyContin's labeling stating that its time-released formula reduced the risk of addiction.
So they basically gave it a stamp of approval.
Yeah, pretty much.
And that reassured doctors.
It did. Doctors and patients felt much more comfortable prescribing it and taking it.
And as a result, prescriptions just skyrocketed.
They went through the roof.
And looking back, I mean, that labeling decision It really played a role in the opioid crisis that followed.
It did. It was a major contributing factor.
Yeah. It's kind of mind-boggling now to think that a drug like OxyContin with its addictive potential was so readily prescribed.
I know it is. In hindsight, it seems crazy.
What were people thinking back then?
Well, there were a lot of factors at play.
Okay.
The 90s saw this big cultural shift towards aggressive pain management. Pain was even dubbed the fifth vital sign.
The fifth vital sign.
Yeah, so doctors were encouraged to treat it more proactively.
Okay.
And pharmaceutical companies like Purdue Pharma, they saw a huge market opportunity.
Right.
So it was kind of this perfect storm.
A perfect storm that led to a public health nightmare.
It did when the truth about OxyContin started to emerge.
Right, the addiction rates, the overdoses.
It was devastating.
And adding to the controversy was that whole thing with Curtis Wright.
Oh yeah, Curtis Wright. He was the FDA official who reviewed OxyContin.
Right.
And later left the agency to take a job at Purdue Pharma.
Wait, so the guy who reviewed the drug ended up working for the company that made it?
Yep.
That's a major conflict of interest.
It is. It really raised a lot of eyebrows and fueled public distrust.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. So what happened after that? I mean, the FDA had to do something, right?
They eventually demanded that Purdue Pharma take action
Okay.
to try to control the situation.
What did Purdue Pharma do?
Well, they removed that misleading safety label.
Okay.
And they added a black box warning.
A black box warning.
It's the strongest warning the FDA can issue.
Okay.
But by then,
The damage was done.
pretty much.
OxyContin was already deeply entrenched in the lives of so many people struggling with addiction.
Yeah, that black box warning didn't really deter those who were already dependent.
Right. So what happened next? I mean, did the government step in at this point?
They did. The DEA actually launched a national action plan specifically targeting OxyContin.
Wow, a national action plan just for OxyContin.
Yeah, it was a first in the agency's history.
Okay, so finally they're recognizing the severity of the problem.
Yes, they are.
And Purdue Pharma, I imagine they faced some consequences for all of this.
They did. They faced a tidal wave of legal action.
Right.
Starting in 2007, they paid over $600 million in fines
$600 million.
for downplaying OxyContin's addictive potential and misleading healthcare providers.
And that was just the beginning, right?
That was just the tip of the iceberg.
Over 3,000 lawsuits were filed against them,
Wow.
resulting in billions of dollars in settlements.
Billions of dollars.
Wow.
Yeah, and ultimately in 2019, Purdue Pharma filed for bankruptcy.
Wow, what a downfall for a company that was once at the forefront of pain management.
It is. It's a real cautionary tale.
What do you think the main takeaway from the OxyContin story is?
I think it really highlights the power of marketing,
Okay.
the influence of pharmaceutical companies, and the need for greater transparency and accountability in the healthcare system.
For sure.
Yeah.
But I think it's also important to remember that the demand for effective pain relief is very real.
Oh, absolutely.
People were and still are desperate for solutions.
Yes.
And unfortunately, that desperation can be exploited.
It can.
It's not just about manipulation and greed.
No.
Many people suffering from chronic pain, they found genuine relief with OxyContin.
They did, at least initially.
We can't forget that.
No, we can't.
But it seems like the pendulum just swung way too far in the direction of aggressive pain management.
It did, and the consequences were devastating.
Yeah. Okay, so we've talked a lot about the physical effects of painkillers.
Right.
But what about the psychological aspect?
Oh, that's an interesting question.
Why are these drugs so alluring? What makes pain relief so desirable, even addictive?
So that's a question that takes us into the world of neurochemistry.
Neurochemistry.
Yeah, so when we experience pain, our bodies naturally release endorphins.
Okay.
And these endorphins, they bind to opioid receptors in the brain.
Okay.
And this triggers the release of dopamine,
Dopamine.
the neurotransmitter associated with pleasure and reward.
Dopamine, the brain's feel-good chemical.
Exactly.
So our bodies have this built-in pain relief system that's linked to pleasure. That's pretty cool.
It is. It's pretty amazing.
But that's where opioid painkillers come in, right?
Right. They essentially mimic the effects of endorphins.
Yeah.
They bind to those same opioid receptors and they flood the brain with dopamine.
So they kind of hijack our natural pain relief system
Yeah, you could say that.
and amplify the pleasure response.
Right.
That makes the addictive potential a lot clearer.
It does.
So what happens with repeated use?
Well, the problem is that with repeated use, the brain becomes accustomed to this artificial flood of dopamine.
Okay.
It starts to crave that feeling,
Right.
and that leads to tolerance dependence and ultimately addiction.
So you need more and more of the drug to achieve the same effect.
Right.
And then withdrawal symptoms kick in when you try to stop.
Exactly. It's a vicious cycle.
It's like this dangerous dance with your brain chemistry.
It is.
So where do we go from here?
That's the big question.
Is the quest for effective pain relief just doomed to be this balancing act between benefits and risks? Between easing suffering and fueling addiction.
Well, that's what researchers and medical professionals are grappling with every day.
Yeah.
The search for the perfect painkiller, one that provides relief without the risk of addiction or harmful side effects, it continues.
Right.
But there's also a growing recognition that we need to look beyond just developing new drugs.
What do you mean by that?
Well, there's this increasing interest in what we call non-pharmacological approaches to pain management.
Non-pharmacological.
Yeah, so things like physical therapy,
Okay.
acupuncture, mindfulness,
Okay.
and even virtual reality therapy are gaining traction.
So these methods, are they trying to empower individuals to manage their pain without solely relying on medication?
Exactly, they're trying to give people more control over their pain.
Okay, so it's about taking a more holistic approach,
Yes,
addressing the root causes of pain rather than just masking the symptoms with pills.
exactly.
It seems like a much more sustainable approach in the long run.
I think so too.
So you're back, and I feel like we've really been on a journey here.
We have from ancient remedies to the opioid crisis.
Yeah, it's a lot to take in.
It is, but it's fascinating stuff.
It really is. You mentioned before the break those non-pharmacological approaches to pain management,
Right.
like physical therapy and mindfulness.
Yeah, those are becoming increasingly popular.
So what makes them so promising?
Well, they kind of address pain from a different angle.
Okay, how so?
Instead of masking the symptoms with medication, they aim to empower individuals to manage their pain proactively.
Take control.
Exactly.
So give me an example.
Okay, so take physical therapy, for example.
Okay.
It strengthens muscles, improves flexibility. It can even help correct postural imbalances that contribute to pain.
So it's really getting to the root of the problem.
Yeah, it's not just a Band-Aid solution.
Right. And what about mindfulness? How does that work?
Well, mindfulness techniques like meditation and deep breathing exercises, they can actually help people cope with chronic pain by changing how they perceive and react to pain signals.
So it's not about eliminating pain entirely.
No, not
It's
necessarily.
about changing your relationship with it.
Exactly, it's about learning to manage it.
That's really interesting. And what about virtual reality therapy?
Oh, that's a really cool one.
That sounds super high tech.
It's basically using virtual reality to create these immersive experiences that can distract from pain and even retrain the brain to perceive pain differently.
Wow. So it's like science fiction come to life.
It kind of is.
It really does. But let's be realistic. I mean, technology, personalized medicine, it can be expensive.
That's true.
So what about access?
That's a big question.
Will everyone be able to benefit from these new treatments?
Well, that's a challenge right now.
Yeah.
Ensuring equitable access to effective pain management is a huge issue.
Especially with healthcare disparities and the costs associated with some of these therapies.
Exactly.
So it's like we're on the cusp of this revolution in pain relief.
We are.
But we need to make sure that everyone can benefit.
Absolutely. It can't just be for the privileged few.
Right. It's got to be for everyone.
It has to be.
Well said. You know, after this deep dive, I'm starting to think that the perfect painkiller might not be a pill at all.
You know what? I think you're right. It's not about finding that one magic bullet.
It's about
recognizing that pain management is complex.
Yeah.
It's multifaceted, and it requires this combination of approaches that are tailored to the individual.
So it's about empowering people to understand their pain,
Yes.
explore different options,
Absolutely.
work with their healthcare providers
Right.
to find what works best for them.
Exactly.
Not a one-size-fits-all solution.
No, definitely not.
And it's also about, I think, having more compassion and understanding
Yes.
for people who live with chronic pain.
Absolutely.
Pain is often invisible,
It is.
and it's hard for other people to grasp what those daily challenges are like.
It is. It's not always easy to see or understand what someone else is going through.
So we need to be more empathetic,
Yes.
more supportive.
Absolutely.
We can't just dismiss it
No.
or tell people to toughen up.
No pain is a real and valid experience.
And everyone deserves to have their pain acknowledged and treated with respect.
I completely agree.
Well, this deep dive has been truly eye-opening.
It has.
We've covered so much.
We have from willow bark to personalized medicine.
It's clear that the history of painkillers is long, it's complicated, and it's still being written.
It is.
So what's one final thought you want to leave our listeners with today?
Given everything we've talked about, I think the big question we need to ask ourselves is, how can we as individuals and as a society create a future where pain is treated with compassion, with understanding, and with a real commitment to finding solutions that prioritize both individual well-being and public health?
It's not just about finding new drugs or therapies.
Oh.
It's about changing our attitudes and approaches to pain itself. That's a powerful message, a call to action for all of us.
It is.
To be more informed, more compassionate, and more engaged in this conversation about pain management.
I think so.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us today.
It's been a pleasure.
This has been a really mind-bending journey through the world of painkillers.
It has.
And to our listeners, Thanks for joining us on this exploration.
Thanks for listening, everyone.
We hope you gained a new perspective on the history of pain relief and the challenges and opportunities that lie ahead.
We've only just scratched the surface.
There's so much more to explore.
There is.
So keep those brains buzzing and those conversations flowing.
And remember,
This is Podcast Infinity, signing off.